Paul is ticked. He has heard what's going on at the church he established in Galatia, which is an area in modern-day Turkey, and he fires off a letter. Have you ever been really upset about something or with someone, and you furiously write an angry email, and then you think, maybe I should sleep on this and send it in the morning? And then you read it in the morning and you think, yeah, I'm not going to send this. Well, Paul didn't sleep on it. He fired that thing off and hit send. So we get all of his anger. What is he so upset about? He's been going out spreading the good news of the gospel, not just in areas where there's an established Jewish population, but also in places like Galatia, where there were no Jews, only pagan Gentiles. And after he gets a church up and running, he goes off to a new place to start a new church there. So he's moved on from Galatia, and now he's gotten a report that after he left, a new group of teachers came, and they basically told the Galatians, Paul got you started on the right path, but if you really want to inherit the promises made to Israel, and you really want to be included when Zion is fully restored, you have to go all the way. You have to become full members of the covenant. And the way to do that is through the rite of circumcision. So yes, they would argue Jesus matters, but the way he matters is that he has opened the door for you to enter into the already established people of Israel. They accuse Paul of just trying to make people happy by saying, oh, you don't need to be circumcised. Like, it's easy religion. All of the goods with none of the cost, they'd say. And Paul is livid. Now, we, on the other hand, may be wondering what all the fuss is about. I mean, why are we still talking about this? Didn't we hear last week from Acts about the council in Jerusalem where they settled all of this? And what does a debate about the circumcision of Gentiles have to do with us today? Well, the debate itself maybe isn't something that we can much relate to, but the conclusions that Paul reaches and what Paul says is at stake here makes it very much worth paying attention to his rage mail. Now, it's worth noting that in Galatians, when Paul refers to the Jews, he is not talking about like the Jewish Jews, the Jews who are not following Jesus as Messiah. He does that later on in the book of Romans, but here he is talking about Jewish Christians when he refers to Jews. This is a letter written to Christians. And I say that because I think it's easy to slip into some unintentional anti-Semitism here, implying that the Torah is bad and Jews are wrong and we need to completely get rid of the Hebrew scriptures because none of that matters anymore. And that is not at all what Paul is saying here. He is not saying that Jewish Christians shouldn't be circumcised, but he is emphasizing in this core verse in chapter 2 that we know that a person is justified not by the works of the law, but through the faith of Jesus Christ. If there were a law that could set all things right, then we'd just do that. But what is actually making things right is Jesus. There's nothing else on top of that, nothing required in addition to this faith of Christ that makes someone fully a part of God's people and fully a part of God's promises to Abraham. This way of participating with Christ through faith is the sole means by which salvation occurs. Now, I want to break down verse 16 a little bit more because this one short statement is doing a lot of heavy lifting, and it's important to unpack what some of these words mean. And the first is the word justified. Now, if you grew up in a Lutheran church, you probably heard the word justified or justification a lot. But what does that actually mean? Some have suggested that the word justification is actually not an overly helpful English word to use to translate the Greek there, because that word has taken on additional overtones in common usage that isn't there in what Paul is saying. What I mean is this: if you think about how we typically use that word justified, we talk about like having to justify one's behavior, right? It sounds like maybe you did something wrong and you're trying to make excuses for it to justify what you did. And that's not at all what Paul means. He's not saying something shady happened and we have to justify it now. So what does he mean? Well, the word translated justify, the root of it is connected also to the word of righteousness. But we don't have an English word to say, like, to righteous someone, so that doesn't work. Some have suggested that rectify is actually a better word, so they talk about rectification instead of justification. I don't know if I love that word either, but I do think it gets us a little closer to what Paul is saying. Paul's framework is that people, and indeed all of creation, are held captive by the forces of evil and death. This causes us to be separated from God because things are not right between us and God when we're living in sin. The Jesus event is significant because it's God breaking into our world and freeing us from those forces, setting things right between us and God, between God and all of creation. So that's where we get rectification, this cosmic setting things right by God. That's what we mean when we say justification. So then we hear that we are justified, that things are set right through the faith of Jesus Christ. And you may think, I've heard that verse differently in the past. There are some translations of that verse that say we are justified through faith in Jesus Christ. We're justified through faith in Jesus. Kind of puts the emphasis on what we're doing, right? When we believe, that's how we are saved. And it turns out that the Greek phrase that's used here can be translated either way. We are justified through faith in Jesus Christ, or we are justified through the faith of Jesus Christ. Hear the difference? It's subtle, but it makes a difference. The faith of Jesus Christ saving us means this is all God. God is the subject. God is the actor. And entire books have been written about which way to translate that. I am pretty comfortable saying, yeah, to both of those translations. I suspect Paul left it ambiguous on purpose because it's all related. The starting point is the faithfulness of Jesus. As I said, God is always the subject. God is the one doing the saving. But it is the faithfulness of Jesus that gives us something to believe in, something to trust our lives in. And that faith that we have is indeed pure gift from God. Either way, it's all about grace. Outrageous grace that changes our relationship with God. Paul understands his own justification as Christ now living in him, Christ living through him. It's not just a gift that's been received, it's being infused with this power of Christ in every aspect of one's life. And this wasn't true just for him, it's true for the whole church. And so that transforms our relationships with each other. Paul wants the Galatians to know that there is no hierarchy or division in terms of what makes somebody acceptable before God. And he wants those who started out in a Jewish tradition and those who started out in a Gentile tradition to live as though that were true, to share in table fellowship, to live fully as the one people of God. Now, in the rest of the book of Galatians, Paul goes into a lot more detail about what this means and the implications of this. But throughout this book, he's basically just trying to reassert this core idea that our salvation comes solely through the faithfulness of Christ. And that is where the rubber hits the road for us today. Because as interesting as it can be to dive into the struggles of first century churches, it's even more important for us to understand the ways in which in our own lives, we are tempted to supplement faith with something else. We feel like we have to do something else. We have to be something else. And we're tempted to assess people based on other measures of acceptability other than simply the fact that they too are recipients of salvation through God's faith. Now, I've spent a fair amount of time here talking theology, kind of some head stuff here. But the gospel message doesn't just influence what we think, but also gets to our hearts. And Paul does that through kind of angrily, but telling his story, reminding the Galatians of his story of his own coming into the Christian faith and how that revealed the grace of God. And so I want to share another story that I think does that too, because this really is the point of what we'll be doing together this Saturday, so come on Saturday. Our stories matter in our lives of faith. The stories we tell reveal God at work in our lives and help us to understand these theological concepts in real life. So this is a story, it's not mine. It's by a professor named Timothy Paul Jones, and I'm simply going to read it to you because I want you to hear it in his voice. He writes, "Our middle daughter had previously been adopted by another family. I'm sure this couple had the best of intentions, but they never quite integrated the adopted child into their family of biological children. After a couple of rough years, they dissolved the adoption, and we ended up welcoming an 8-year-old girl into our home. For one reason or another, whenever our daughter's previous family vacationed at Disney World, they took their biological children with them, but they left their adopted daughter with a family friend. Usually, at least in the child's mind, this happened because she did something wrong that precluded her presence on the trip. And so by the time we adopted our daughter, she had seen many pictures of Disney World, and she had heard about the rides and the characters and the parades. But when it came to passing through the gates of the Magic Kingdom, she had always been the one left on the outside. Once I found out about this history, I made plans to take her to Disney World the next time a speaking engagement took our family to the southeastern United States. I thought I had mastered the Disney World drill. I knew from previous experiences that the prospect of seeing cast members in freakishly oversized mouse and duck costumes somehow turns children into squirming bundles of emotional instability. What I didn't expect was that the prospect of visiting this dream world would produce a stream of downright devilish behavior in our newest daughter. In the month leading up to our trip to the Magic Kingdom, she stole food when a simple request would have gained her a snack. She lied when it would have been easier to tell the truth. She whispered insults that were carefully crafted to hurt her older sister as deeply as possible. And as the days on the calendar moved closer to the trip, her mutinies multiplied. A couple of days before our family headed to Florida, I pulled our daughter into my lap to talk through her latest escapade. "I know what you're going to do," she stated flatly. "You're not going to take me to Disney World, are you?" The thought actually hadn't crossed my mind, but her downward spiral suddenly started to make some sense. She knew she couldn't earn her way into the magic kingdom. She had tried and failed that test several times before. So she was living in a way that placed her as far as possible from the most magical place on earth. In retrospect, I'm embarrassed to admit that in that moment, I was tempted to turn her fear to my own advantage. The easiest response would have been, if you don't start behaving better, you're right, we won't take you. But by God's grace, I didn't. Instead, I asked her, is this trip something we're doing as a family? She nodded, brown eyes wide and tear-rimmed. Are you part of this family? She nodded again. Then you're going with us. Sure, there may be some consequences to help you remember what's right and what's wrong, but you're part of our family, and we're not leaving you behind. I'd like to say that her behaviors grew better after that moment. They didn't. Her choices pretty much spiraled out of control at every hotel and rest stop all the way to Lake Buena Vista. Still, we headed to Disney World on the day we had promised, and it was a typical Disney day. Overpriced tickets, overpriced meals, and lots of lines, mingled with just enough manufactured magic to consider maybe going again someday. In our hotel room that evening, a very different child emerged. She was exhausted, pensive, and a little weepy at times, but her month-long facade of rebellion had faded. When bedtime rolled around, I prayed with her, held her, and asked, "So how was your first day at Disney World?" She closed her eyes and snuggled down into her stuffed unicorn. After a few moments, she opened her eyes ever so slightly. "Daddy," she said, "I finally got to go to Disney World. But it wasn't because I was good. It's because I'm yours." It wasn't because I was good. It's because I'm yours. That's the message of outrageous grace. That is what Paul is so desperate for the Galatians to understand. We belong to God's family, and God will not leave us behind. Through Christ, God claims us as beloved children, and we enter into that kingdom not because we are good, but because we are His. Amen.